Good evening, dear generals, and welcome to Men Around the Führer series. In the spring of 1933, a newly appointed commandant arrived at a small detention facility outside Munich. His name was Theodor Eicke, and he was about to transform a makeshift prison into something far more sinister. Within months, he would create a blueprint for systematic brutality that would be replicated across an entire continent. He would train the men who would oversee the murder of millions. And when war came, he would lead these men into battle, commanding one of the most notorious divisions in military history. This is the story of Theodor Eicke, the man who built the machinery of the Holocaust. But to understand how someone becomes the architect of industrial-scale atrocity, we must first understand where he came from. And the truth is both disturbing and illuminating. Theodor Eicke was not a monster from birth. He was a product of his time, his circumstances, and his choices. A man whose life of failure and resentment found purpose in the most terrible ideology of the 20th century. Theodor Eicke was born on October 17, 1892, in the Alsatian town of Hampont, then part of the German Empire. His father was a railroad station master, a respectable but modest position. The family was neither wealthy nor impoverished, neither particularly educated nor entirely ignorant. They were, in every sense, ordinary. But ordinariness would define Eicke's early life in ways that would shape his future brutality. He was an unremarkable student, showing neither particular talent nor complete incompetence. He completed his basic education, but went no further. When he turned 17, he tried to follow in his father's footsteps, training as a railroad clerk. He hated it. The work was tedious, the prospects limited, the status minimal. For a young man with undefined ambitions and a growing sense that the world owed him something, the railroad offered nothing but decades of quiet mediocrity. So in 1913, at age 20, Eicke made a decision that would fundamentally alter his trajectory. He volunteered for the German army. Military service in Imperial Germany offered something that civilian life did not: structure, purpose, and the possibility of advancement based on qualities other than education or family connections. For men like Eicke, the army was an escape from the limitations of their birth. When World War I erupted in August 1914, Eicke was already in uniform. He served with the 23rd Infantry Regiment, fighting on the Western Front. Unlike many of the men we have examined in this series, Eicke did not distinguish himself in combat. He was not a natural warrior, not a tactical genius, not even particularly brave. He was promoted to the rank of Zahlmeister, essentially a paymaster, handling administrative duties rather than leading men in battle. But the war changed him nonetheless. 4 years of industrial slaughter, 4 years of seeing the old order collapse, 4 years of believing in victory only to watch it turn to defeat. By the time the armistice was signed in November 1918, Eicke had developed the mindset that would define his future, a conviction that Germany had been betrayed, that weakness and treachery had stolen victory, and that ruthlessness was the only response to a hostile world. The post-war years were, for Eicke, a descent into obscurity and failure. He left the army and returned to civilian life, marrying Bertha Schwebel in 1914. They would have 2 children together. He needed work, and he returned to what he knew: clerical positions, administrative jobs, nothing glamorous or well-paying. He worked for the police in Ludwigshafen. He tried his hand at security work. He bounced from job to job, never quite finding his place, never quite achieving the success he believed he deserved. By the late 1920s, he was a man approaching 40 with little to show for his life. No career achievements, no status, no recognition. Just a wife, 2 children, and a growing reservoir of bitterness. This was the perfect psychological profile for radicalization. A man who felt the world had denied him his due, who blamed external forces for his failures, who longed for a movement that would validate his resentments and offer him power he could never achieve through legitimate means. He found that movement in the Nazi Party. Eicke joined the NSDAP in 1928, relatively early in the party's growth, but not in its founding years. He threw himself into party work with the fervor of a man who had finally found purpose. He joined the SA, the brown-shirted street fighters, and quickly gained a reputation for 2 qualities: absolute loyalty to Adolf Hitler and absolute ruthlessness toward anyone deemed an enemy. In 1930, he transferred to the SS, the elite paramilitary organization led by Heinrich Himmler. The SS appealed to Eicke because it offered what the SA did not: exclusivity, ideology, and the promise of becoming the racial and political vanguard of the new Germany. For a man obsessed with hierarchy and distinction, the black uniform meant everything. But Eicke's fanaticism soon created problems. In 1932, he was involved in a series of violent actions that attracted police attention. He prepared bomb attacks against political opponents. The Bavarian government, still functioning under Weimar rules, issued a warrant for his arrest. Eicke fled to Italy, where he remained in exile, burning with rage at the system that had forced him to flee. Then came January 30, 1933. Hitler became chancellor. Everything changed. Eicke returned to Germany, his crimes now transformed into badges of honor. The system he had fought against was collapsing. The movement he had served was taking power, and Heinrich Himmler remembered the fanatic who had risked everything for the cause. In June 1933, Himmler gave Eicke an assignment that would define the rest of his life: commandant of Dachau concentration camp. When Eicke arrived at Dachau, it was a chaotic, improvised facility. Originally a munitions factory, it had been hastily converted into a detention center for political prisoners, communists, social democrats, trade unionists, anyone the new regime considered dangerous. The guards were a mix of SA men and local police, poorly trained and operating with no clear rules. Brutality was common but arbitrary. The whole operation was, in Himmler's view, inefficient. Eicke saw opportunity. Here was a blank slate where he could impose order, discipline, and systematic terror. Here was a place where his administrative skills, his ideological fanaticism, and his capacity for cruelty could combine into something unprecedented. Within months, Eicke transformed Dachau from a makeshift prison into a model of organized oppression. He created a comprehensive set of regulations: the Disziplinar- und Strafordnung, the disciplinary and penal code. This document, approved by Himmler, became the foundation for the entire concentration camp system. The regulations were a bureaucratic masterpiece of dehumanization. They specified exactly how prisoners were to be treated, which offenses warranted which punishments, and under what circumstances guards could use lethal force. Prisoners were divided into categories based on their supposed offenses, each category marked by different colored triangles: red for political prisoners, green for criminals, pink for homosexuals, purple for Jehovah's Witnesses. But the true innovation was not the categorization, it was the systematization of terror. Eicke understood something that many brutal regimes had failed to grasp. Arbitrary violence is less effective than predictable violence. If prisoners never knew what would provoke punishment, they lived in constant chaos. But if they knew exactly what would result in severe consequences, they would police their own behavior and that of their fellow inmates. The regulations specified that any prisoner who attempted escape would be shot immediately. Any prisoner who attacked a guard would be hanged. Any prisoner who engaged in political agitation would be placed in solitary confinement and subjected to enhanced punishment. The document was precise, methodical, and utterly ruthless, and it worked. Dachau became orderly, efficient, and more terrifying than any chaotic prison could be. The camp ran like a machine, and that machine's purpose was the destruction of human dignity and the enforcement of absolute obedience. But regulations were only half of Eicke's innovation. The other half was his transformation of the guards themselves. Eicke understood that ordinary men, even those sympathetic to Nazi ideology, might hesitate to commit the acts required in a concentration camp. So he created a new breed of guard, trained specifically for this purpose. These were the SS Totenkopf Division, the Death's Head units, named after the skull insignia they wore on their uniforms. Eicke recruited young men, often from rural areas, often poorly educated, often economically desperate. He put them through intensive ideological training, teaching them that prisoners were not human beings, but enemies of the German people, vermin that needed to be controlled and eliminated. He created a culture of absolute loyalty, where guards who showed any sympathy toward prisoners were themselves subject to punishment. He rewarded brutality and punished compassion. The result was a corps of men capable of extraordinary cruelty. They beat prisoners for minor infractions. They withheld food and medical care. They conducted arbitrary punishments to maintain fear. And they did it all with the confidence that they were serving a higher purpose. In October 1934, Himmler promoted Eicke to inspector of concentration camps and leader of SS Guard formations. The commandant of Dachau was now responsible for the entire concentration camp system. Every new camp built in Germany and Austria would follow the Dachau model. Every guard unit would be trained according to Eicke's methods. By the late 1930s, there were 6 major concentration camps in operation: Dachau, Sachsenhausen, Buchenwald, Flossenbürg, Mauthausen, and Ravensbrück. All followed Eicke's blueprint. All were staffed by Death's Head units trained in his methods. The system that would eventually facilitate the murder of millions was now in place, and Theodor Eicke had built it. But there was another dimension to Eicke's role, one that revealed the moral depths to which he had descended. In June 1934, during the Night of the Long Knives, Hitler's purge of the SA leadership, Eicke personally participated in the murder of Ernst Röhm, the SA chief of staff. Röhm had been arrested and imprisoned in Munich's Stadelheim prison. Hitler initially hesitated to order his execution, bound by years of personal friendship, but Himmler and Hermann Göring convinced him that Röhm was too dangerous to leave alive. The order was given: Röhm must die. Eicke volunteered for the task. Along with SS officer Michael Lippert, he entered Röhm's cell. They gave him a pistol and 10 minutes to commit suicide. Röhm refused, so Eicke and Lippert shot him themselves, multiple times, at point-blank range. This was not combat. This was not justice. This was murder, cold and calculated, and Eicke carried it out without hesitation. For his loyalty, Hitler personally praised him. For his willingness to kill on command, Himmler trusted him with ever greater authority. By the late 1930s, Eicke had transformed from a failed clerk into one of the most powerful men in the SS. He had created a system that would outlast him. He had trained thousands of men in the methods of systematic brutality. He had proven himself willing to commit any act, no matter how heinous, in service to the regime. But then came war, and with it, a new role. When Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, Eicke saw an opportunity. He was an administrator, a bureaucrat of terror, but he longed to be a warrior. He wanted combat command, military glory, the validation that came from leading men in battle rather than simply training them to torture prisoners. Himmler agreed. The SS was expanding from a paramilitary organization into a full military force, the Waffen-SS. Eicke's Death's Head units would be transformed into combat divisions, and Eicke would command one of them. In October 1939, the SS Totenkopf Division was formed, with Eicke as its commander. The division was built around the core of concentration camp guards, men trained in Eicke's methods, men who had spent years brutalizing unarmed prisoners. Now they would face armed soldiers. The division first saw combat during the invasion of France in May 1940. And immediately, the world saw what happened when men trained in atrocity were given military power. On May 27, 1940, soldiers of the Totenkopf Division committed one of the first major war crimes of the Western Front. At Le Paradis, near the French-Belgian border, they captured nearly 100 British soldiers from the Royal Norfolk Regiment who had surrendered after fierce fighting. The British prisoners were disarmed and lined up against a barn wall. Then the SS opened fire with machine guns, massacring 97 men. 2 British soldiers survived by feigning death beneath the bodies of their comrades. They would later testify to the atrocity. The commander responsible, Fritz Knöchlein, was executed for war crimes in 1949. But the massacre revealed something essential about Eicke's division. These were not ordinary soldiers. They were men who saw enemies as less than human, who had no concept of the laws of war, who carried the mentality of the concentration camp onto the battlefield. Eicke himself was not directly involved in Le Paradis, but he bore responsibility for the culture he had created. He had trained these men. He had instilled in them the belief that mercy was weakness and brutality was strength. The concentration camp guard became the war criminal, became the combat soldier, and the transition was seamless. The Totenkopf Division fought throughout the French campaign, then participated in the invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941. Operation Barbarossa was, from the beginning, a war of annihilation, and the Totenkopf Division fit perfectly into this paradigm. They fought with fanaticism, took few prisoners, and showed no mercy to civilians or partisans. Eicke proved to be a competent tactical commander, though not a brilliant one. He understood how to motivate his men, how to enforce discipline, how to drive them forward through will and ideology. But he lacked the strategic vision of commanders like Manstein or Model. He was not a military genius. He was a fanatic who happened to be in command of a military unit. In January 1943, the Totenkopf Division was trapped in the Demyansk pocket, surrounded by Soviet forces. For months, they fought desperately, supplied only by air, suffering enormous casualties. Eicke flew in and out of the pocket repeatedly, refusing to abandon his men, personally leading defensive operations. On February 26, 1943, Eicke was flying in a light reconnaissance aircraft over the front lines near Orelka when Soviet anti-aircraft fire struck the plane. It crashed, killing everyone aboard. Theodor Eicke, the architect of the concentration camp system, was dead at age 50. His death was militarily insignificant. One divisional commander among hundreds, but symbolically it marked something important. The man who had created the machinery of systematic murder had died violently, killed by the very war his ideology had unleashed. The Totenkopf Division would continue fighting until the end of the war, committing atrocities throughout. The concentration camp system Eicke built would expand into the death camps of Auschwitz, Treblinka, and Sobibor. The men he trained would oversee the murder of millions. His legacy was not tactics or strategy, but the systematization of industrial genocide. So who was Theodor Eicke? A failed clerk who found purpose in ideology, a bitter man who found power in brutality, a fanatic who transformed personal resentment into systematic atrocity. He was not insane, not incomprehensible, not a cartoon villain. He was a human being who made choices, terrible choices, at every step of his life. He chose to join the Nazi Party. He chose to embrace its ideology. He chose to volunteer for violent actions. He chose to create the regulations that governed the camps. He chose to train men in methods of torture. He chose to participate in murder. And he chose to command a division that carried concentration camp mentality onto the battlefield. Each choice built upon the previous one, until he had constructed a life defined entirely by destruction. And in the end, destruction claimed him too. The story of Theodor Eicke is a warning about the banality of evil. To borrow Hannah Arendt's phrase, he was not exceptionally intelligent or exceptionally talented. He was not charismatic or visionary. He was ordinary in almost every way, except for his willingness to embrace ideology that justified his worst impulses and his capacity to systematize his cruelty. This is perhaps the most terrifying lesson of his life. You do not need to be a monster to enable monstrous acts. You only need to be a failed man who finds purpose in a terrible cause and the willingness to build systems that allow ordinary people to commit extraordinary evil. Theodor Eicke built those systems, and millions died because of them. That's all for tonight. Thanks for watching.